Clara Bennett pressed her mother's necklace against her chest and told herself she would not cry. Not here. Not in front of these people. The shopkeeper's laughter cut through the air like a whip, loud enough for the whole street to hear, and every face that turned toward her wore the same expression, pity dressed up as contempt. She had traveled 600 miles on the promise of a new life. Now she stood in a stranger's town with empty hands, an empty stomach, and nowhere left to go. If this story of a woman who refused to break moves your heart, subscribe to our channel. Follow Clara's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach pulled away before the dust had even settled. Clara Bennett stood on the unpaved main street of Millhaven, Montana Territory, and watched it go. She held her suitcase with both hands, a small battered thing that had belonged to her mother. The leather cracked along one side where she had tied it shut with a piece of rope because the latch no longer worked. Inside were 2 dresses, a wool shawl, a Bible with her mother's handwriting in the margins, and a folded letter that had promised her everything. She unfolded that letter now, though she had already memorized every word. Dear Miss Bennett, I am pleased to offer you the position of cook and housekeeper at the Dunmore Ranch, Millhaven, Montana Territory. You will receive room board and $12 per month. Please arrive by the 15th of July. Harold Dunmore. The 15th of July had been 3 days ago. She had arrived 2 days late because the stagecoach had thrown a wheel in the middle of Wyoming, and every passenger had spent the night sleeping against their luggage in the roadside dust. Clara had spent those hours telling herself it would be fine. She would explain. Mr. Dunmore would understand. Reasonable people understood things like broken wheels and bad weather. She asked the first person she passed, a woman in a yellow dress carrying a basket of bread, where she might find the Dunmore Ranch. The woman stopped. She looked at Clara's suitcase. She looked at Clara's dress, which was her second best, the blue cotton one, with the small white buttons she had mended twice at the collar. She looked at Clara's boots, which were good boots, her best boots, but they were dusty from the road, and the heel of the left one had a crack she hadn't been able to afford to repair. Harold Dunmore, the woman said. Yes, ma'am. I have a letter from him offering me employment. The woman's expression shifted into something Clara couldn't quite name. Well, she said slowly, you'd better ask someone at the general store. I don't want to be the one to tell you. She walked away before Clara could ask another question. The general store sat at the center of Millhaven's Main Street, a wide-fronted building with a porch that sagged on one side and a hand-painted sign above the door reading, Galt's Mercantile Goods Provisions Hardware. A few men sat in chairs on the porch. They watched Clara cross the street. None of them smiled. She pushed open the door. The man behind the counter was heavy-set somewhere past 50, with small pale eyes and a thick gray mustache. He wore a white apron over a striped shirt, and he was weighing out flour into a paper sack when Clara walked in. He looked up. He looked her over, the same slow assessment she'd gotten from the woman in the yellow dress, the same reading of her dress and her boots and her suitcase. And something in his expression settled into a kind of flat amusement. Help you, he said without sounding like he meant it. I'm looking for Mr. Harold Dunmore, Clara said. I've come from Illinois. He hired me as cook and housekeeper. I have a letter. Harold Dunmore's gone, the man said. Clara stopped. Gone. Packed up and left 2 weeks ago. Wife took sick, her family's back in Ohio. He sold the ranch and went after her. Didn't tell nobody until the day before he left. The man shrugged, the way a person shrugs when something has nothing to do with them. You came a long way for nothing, looks like. Clara stood very still. She heard the words. She understood them. But some part of her was still standing in her mother's kitchen back in Galesburg, reading that letter. For the first time, feeling the relief of it, a way out, a real wage, a real chance, and that part of her was having some difficulty catching up to where she actually was. Is there, she started, is there anyone else in town who might need? We got cooks, the man said. We got housekeepers. What we don't got is a need for more of either. He went back to his flour. Clara stood at the counter for a moment longer. Then she reached into the neck of her dress and pulled out her mother's necklace. It was a small thing, a thin gold chain with a pressed glass pendant, pale blue, shaped like a teardrop. Her mother had worn it every day of her life until the day she died, and Clara had worn it every day since. She held it out across the counter. "I have this," she said. "I don't have money for a room or a meal. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a trade, a fair one. Whatever you think this is worth." The man looked at the necklace. He didn't touch it. He didn't lean forward for a better look. He just looked at it the way a person looks at something they've already decided isn't worth their time. "That's glass," he said. "The chain is gold." "That's tin," he said. From somewhere behind her, someone laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, the kind that isn't trying to hide itself. Clara didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the man behind the counter, and she kept her hand steady, even though her heart was doing something uncomfortable behind her ribs. "Miss," the man said, and his voice had taken on a different quality, now louder, a performance for whatever audience had assembled. "I don't know what kind of place you come from, but out here, we don't run a charity house. You show up in my town with no money, no job, no people, and a piece of glass on a string, and you expect me to feed you." He shook his head. "The West ain't a fairy tale. Maybe you ought to gone back east before you got yourself stranded out here with nothing." More laughter. There were 3 or 4 people in the store now. Clara realized, though she hadn't heard them come in. She could feel them behind her like a change in the weather. "I'm not asking you to feed me," she said, and her voice was steady, which surprised her. "I'm asking you to make a fair trade." "I already told you what that necklace is worth," the man said. "Nothing." Clara closed her fingers around the pendant. She pulled her hand back. She put the necklace back inside her dress close to her heart, where her mother had always kept it, and she told herself, "Do not cry. You can do anything else. You can be angry, you can be frightened. You can feel every one of these things pressing down on you at once, but you will not cry in front of these people." She turned toward the door. "Where you gonna go, honey?" one of the men behind her said. Not unkindly, almost curiously, the way someone might wonder about a stray dog. "You got nowhere to go." "Millhaven ain't exactly known for taking in strays," another voice added, and this one was not trying to be kind. "Especially ones that show up with no money and expect folks to take care of them." "I don't expect anyone to take care of me," Clara said without turning around. Her hand was on the door. "I never have." She pushed it open. The heat hit her like a wall. July in Montana was nothing like July in Illinois. The air was different here, thinner and drier, and the sun came down without apology. She stepped onto the porch and stood there for a moment, her suitcase in her hand, and looked up and down the main street of Millhaven. She had 6 cents in her pocket. That was the entirety of what she had left after the stagecoach fare. 6 cents and a necklace that a man had just told her was worth nothing. She had come 600 miles to a job that no longer existed. The nearest town was 40 miles east, and she had no way to get there. She was trying to think methodically, the way she always thought through problems, the way her mother had taught her, one piece at a time. No panicking until you've looked at every option. When the door behind her opened, she heard boots on the porch boards. Heavy, slow, deliberate. And then the store went quiet. Not the regular quiet of people minding their own business. The specific quiet that falls when someone walks into a room and changes the air. Clara turned. Howe was standing in the doorway of the general store with one hand braced against the frame, and he was looking at her. She would place him at around 34, 35. Though something in his face made him seem older, not aged exactly, but weathered in the way that mountains are weathered, as though a great deal had moved over him without breaking him. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than performance. His shirt was plain gray cotton rolled at the sleeves, and his hat was pushed back far enough that she could see his eyes. Gray-blue, the color of sky right before a storm decides what it's going to do. Howe was looking at her with an expression that was difficult to read. Not pity. Not the flat assessment she'd gotten from the shopkeeper. Something more careful than that. Like he was waiting to see what she would do next. Then he looked past her through the doorway at the man behind the counter. "Galt," he said. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't need volume to carry. The shopkeeper, Galt, stopped smiling. "Whitmore," he said. The man on the porch stepped back inside the store. He moved past Clara without brushing her, without speaking to her, and he crossed to the counter. He reached into his shirt pocket and set a few coins down on the wood, without counting them out, without making a show of it. "Give her a meal," he said. "Whatever she wants from your shelves, and a room at the boarding house if there's one open." Golt looked at the coins. He looked at the man, Whitmore, and whatever he was thinking, he had the sense not to say it out loud. "Yes, sir," he said. Whitmore turned. He looked at Clara again with those storm-colored eyes, and she realized she hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't done anything except stand there holding her suitcase and staring at him like she'd never seen a person before. "Miss," he said. He touched the brim of his hat. "I'm sorry for the trouble you've had." "I don't know you," Clara said. It came out before she could decide whether it was the right thing to say. He didn't seem offended. "No, ma'am, you don't." "I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "I didn't ask for that." "No," he agreed. "You didn't." He looked at her steadily. "You were asking for a trade, which is a different thing." She didn't know what to say to that. He looked at her suitcase. He looked at the door and at the street beyond it, and then back at her. "You came here for work," he said. It wasn't a question. "Dunmore's ranch," she said. "He hired me. But he's gone. I heard." He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that felt like thinking rather than dismissal. "I've got a ranch," he said. 20 miles north up the ridge. It's been running short on help since spring." He paused. "I need someone who knows their way around a kitchen. And a garden, if you know anything about that." Clara looked at him. She had stood in this town for less than an hour. She had been laughed at, dismissed, and told she was worth nothing. And now a man she had never met was offering her a job in a place 20 miles from anywhere, and she didn't know the first thing about him, except that he'd put money on a counter for her without being asked, and that the shopkeeper had looked at him differently than he looked at anyone else. "Why?" she said. He seemed to think about it seriously, the way a person considers a question that deserves an honest answer. "Because I watched what just happened in there," he said, "and you didn't ask for a handout. You stood your ground. That's worth something." He looked away for a moment, out at the street, then back. "And because my cook quit 3 months ago and my men are starting to look at the horses wrong." It surprised her into something that was almost a laugh, not quite but close enough that the tightness in her chest loosened a fraction. "Is it safe?" she said. 20 miles north, alone. I don't know you, mister." "Whitmore," he said. "Caleb Whitmore." He said it the way you say something you're used to having stand on its own. "I can give you names in town to ask about me if that would help. Mrs. Aldridge at the post office. Reverend Cole." He shrugged slightly. "I'm not much for socializing, so the list is short. But they'll tell you the truth." Clara looked at him. She looked at the general store and the street and the 6 cents in her pocket. She thought about the 600 miles she had already traveled. She thought about her mother's voice. "You are more capable than you think you are, Clara. The trouble is, you've never been in a situation that required you to prove it." "I can cook," she said. "I know herbs and medicines. I've kept people through fever and worse. I can garden, sew, keep accounts if you need it." She met his eyes. "I work for fair wages. I don't ask for charity, and I don't accept pity. If that's what you're offering, I'll find another way." Caleb Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. "I'm offering $12 a month," he said. "Room and board, same as Dunmore promised you." He paused. "Work starts when you're ready." "I'm ready now," Clara said. Something shifted in his expression so small she might have imagined it. Not a smile, not quite, but something that moved across his face and was gone before she could name it. "Wagon's out back," he said. "I'll be done with my errands in an hour." He walked back inside the store. Clara stood on the porch for a moment. She pressed her hand against the front of her dress, against the place where her mother's necklace hung close to her skin, and she breathed. Then she picked up her suitcase and went to find the wagon. She spent the hour on the bench of Caleb Whitmore's wagon while he moved through his business in town, and she spent it doing what she always did when she was trying not to feel afraid. She observed. She watched the way people on the street treated him, the way they gave him a certain amount of space. Not out of dislike, but out of something closer to respect, the way you respect a large, calm animal that you're not entirely sure you understand. Several men nodded to him. He nodded back. No one stopped him to chat. He didn't invite it. When he climbed up into the wagon seat beside her, he handed her a paper-wrapped package without a word. She opened it. Bread, a piece of hard cheese, and a small jar of preserved peaches. She looked at him. "Long ride," he said, picking up the reins. She ate without speaking, because she was hungry enough that pride was a luxury she could not afford, and because he didn't seem to require conversation. He drove north, and the town fell away behind them, and the land opened up on either side into the broad burning sweep of Montana. Summer dry grass and sage, and the blue mountains cutting across the horizon like something out of a dream. After a while she said, "Do you have other workers at the ranch?" "3," he said. "Hector, Pete, and a boy named Sam, who showed up 2 springs ago and doesn't seem inclined to leave." He paused. "Good men. They stay out of what isn't their business." "Is that a warning?" she said. He glanced at her sideways. "It's information," he said. "You seemed like someone who'd want it." She considered that. "Fair enough," she said. They were quiet again. "The woman in the store," Clara said eventually. "The one with the flower. He called you Whitmore like he knew you." "Galt," Caleb said. He said the name with no particular emotion, which somehow conveyed a great deal. "He knows me." "He didn't want to give you any trouble." "No," Caleb said. "He didn't." She waited to see if he would say more. He didn't. But after a moment he added, "I don't use that kind of thing lightly." And she understood he meant whatever influence he had, whatever made men like Galt careful around him. "It's not something I like to use." "You used it for me," she said. "You weren't asking for charity." He said exactly as he'd said before. "You were asking for fairness. Those are different things. A person ought to be able to ask for fairness." Clara looked at the road ahead. Something in her throat felt unexpectedly full, and she pressed her lips together and breathed through it and told herself she was simply tired from traveling and the heat and the day's accumulation of small violences. It had nothing to do with the way he'd said fairness, like it was something real, something a person was actually owed. "Why do you live 20 miles from town?" she asked to change the subject. Howe was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "I like the quiet," he said. "And I don't need much that town has to offer." "What do you need?" He turned his head and looked at her directly for the first time since they'd left Millhaven. The look lasted only a second, but it was the kind of look that seems to take in more than a second should allow. "Right now," he said, "a cook." The ranch appeared when they crested a long rise in the land, and Clara's first impression was of size. It was larger than she'd expected, a collection of buildings spreading across a shallow valley. The main house solid and square with a wide porch, the barn standing separate and dark, the smaller outbuildings arranged in a loose half-circle behind. Fences ran in every direction, some of them straight and tight, others sagging where posts had rotted or been knocked loose and not yet repaired. Everything looked like it was exactly one good effort away from being fine. The yard was quiet when they pulled in. 2 horses lifted their heads from the corral fence and watched. A dog, large gray-muzzled with the slow dignity of a very old animal, rose from a patch of shade by the porch steps and walked toward them at a stately pace. "That's Amos," Caleb said, climbing down from the wagon seat. The dog reached Clara before Caleb came around to her side, and it sat down in front of her and looked up at her with amber eyes that seemed to have opinions about most things. She held out her hand. Amos sniffed it gravely, then allowed her to touch his head. "He doesn't do that with most people," Caleb said. He was watching from a few feet away, and there was something in his voice she couldn't quite identify. "I spent 3 years nursing sick animals on my neighbor's farm back home," she said. "They can tell." "Can they?" "They always could." She picked up her suitcase and looked at the house. Up close, she could see a broken shutter, a window with a crack running through the lower corner. The porch railing on one side pulled loose from its post. A garden space on the east side of the house that was nothing but hard dirt and a few ghost shapes of plants that had given up and died. A kitchen window dark. "Where's the kitchen?" she said. "Back of the house," he said. "How long since anyone cooked in it?" "3 months," he said. "Since Morales quit." She nodded. She looked at the window and thought about what 3 months of neglect looked like in a kitchen, and then decided she would find out for herself rather than asking. She turned to face him. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I'm going to need a few things made clear before I start." "All right," he said. "I work from before sunup to after sundown," she said. "I cook, I clean, I keep the larder, I tend the garden. Whatever honest work there is, I'll do it. But I set my own schedule, and I run my kitchen my way. If something isn't being done right, I'll tell you. If something can't be done the way you want, I'll tell you that too." She paused. "I don't take orders I haven't been told the reason for, and I don't tolerate anyone in my kitchen who isn't there to eat or to help." He listened to all of this without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Anything else?" "Yes," she said. "If I find I can't work here for any reason, I need enough notice to get back to town. Not being stranded is a condition of employment." "Fair," he said. "And I'd like Sundays off." "Done," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with that unreadable expression again, the careful one, the one that felt like assessment, but not judgment. "You have conditions too, I imagine," she said. "One," he said. "There's a room at the end of the East Hall. The door stays closed." Clara waited. He didn't explain. She thought about pressing, and then thought about the day she'd had, and decided some questions could wait. "All right," she said. He nodded once. He turned toward the barn. Then he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. "Hector will help you carry anything you need from the store shed," he said. "And Miss Bennett." He said her name like he'd been careful to remember it. "You did a brave thing today, standing your ground in that store." His jaw moved slightly like he was deciding whether to say the next thing. "I know it doesn't feel like much when a person's still standing in the middle of it, but I saw it." He walked to the barn before she could find an answer. Clara stood in the yard with her suitcase and her 6 cents and her mother's necklace, and old Amos leaned against her leg with the comfortable certainty of a dog who has decided that someone is worth leaning on. She pressed her hand to her chest. She breathed. Then she picked up her suitcase, went around to the back of the house, and opened the kitchen door. The smell hit her first. The sour, stale smell of a room that had been closed too long, of old grease and dust, and the faint sweetness of something that had gone bad months ago and dried into the floorboards. The room was dim and cluttered, pots stacked without order. A rusted grate, a table with a split down the center flower, hardened into the wood where it had been spilled and not cleaned up. Clara set her suitcase down. She looked around the room. She pushed up her sleeves. She had been promised nothing she'd received today. She had lost a job before she'd even started it. She had been laughed at and dismissed in front of a room full of strangers. She was 20 miles from the nearest town, alone in a stranger's house in a territory she'd never seen before today. None of that would change tonight. But this kitchen, she could change. Starting right now. Starting with whatever she could find in the next hour before the light failed. She found a broom leaning against the wall, and she started to sweep. Outside, the sun moved toward the mountains and the shadows lengthened across the valley. The horses in the corral shifted and blew. Amos lay down on the porch and put his heavy head on his paws. And in the kitchen at the back of Caleb Whitmore's house, for the first time in months, there was the sound of someone working. Clara had the kitchen functional by the time the stars came out. Not clean, not the way she intended to make it clean, not the deep down, start from the walls and work forward clean that the room needed, but functional. The floor swept, the old grease scrubbed off the stovetop, the rusted grate knocked loose and replaced with the spare one she'd found hanging on a nail behind the door. She'd found dried beans in a sealed tin, salt pork wrapped in cloth that was still good, onions braided and hanging in the store shed that Hector had shown her before he'd disappeared back to the bunkhouse with a quiet nod and no words. She'd made a pot of something that was halfway between a stew and a soup, thick and hot, and she'd set it on the table with the bread she'd found in the cold box, stale but not gone, and she'd called out the back door into the dark because she didn't know where anyone was or what the custom was in this house. Hector came first. He was a compact man in his 40s, dark-haired with a face that had spent decades outdoors and showed it. He took off his hat when he came through the door, which she noted. He looked at the pot on the table, and then at her with an expression that was difficult to interpret. And then he sat down and ate without a word until the bowl was half empty. "Good," he said, just the one word. "Thank you," she said. Pete came next. Younger, red-haired, freckled, with the kind of easy grin that suggested he was friendly with everyone and trusted by no one in particular. He said, "Ma'am," sat down, ate, and told her twice that it was the best thing he'd had in 3 months, which she suspected was less a compliment to her cooking and more an indictment of whatever they'd been eating before she arrived. Sam came last. He was younger than she'd expected from the way Caleb had described him, maybe 19, with a thin, serious face and eyes that watched everything with quiet intensity. He sat at the far end of the table and ate without speaking. But when he finished, he carried his bowl to the basin without being asked, and that told her more about him than a conversation would have. Caleb did not come. She filled a bowl and covered it with a cloth and set it on the back of the stove, where it would stay warm, and she told herself that was simply the practical thing to do, and not anything more than that. She was washing the last of the pots when she heard his boots on the porch. The back door opened, and he came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw the bowl waiting on the stove. He looked at it for a moment, and she kept her attention on the pot she was scrubbing. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You paid for the food," she said. "It'd be wasteful to let it sit." He took the bowl to the table. She heard the scrape of the chair, the quiet sounds of a man eating alone. She finished the pots and dried her hands and turned around, and he was sitting with his elbows on the table, looking at nothing in particular, the way a person looks when their mind is somewhere else entirely. "It's good," he said. "It's beans and salt pork," she said. "Tomorrow will be better once I know what you have in the store." He nodded. He set his spoon down. He looked at her with that careful, measuring look. "How are you settling?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. "That's not what I asked." She paused. She looked at him. He was watching her with a directness that was not unkind, and she found she didn't have a prepared answer for it. "I've been in harder situations," she said finally. "I'll manage." "I don't doubt that," he said. And the way he said it, simply without emphasis, like a fact rather than a compliment, was somehow more steadying than anything reassuring would have been. She said goodnight and found her room at the end of the west hall, small, clean, with a window that faced the mountains, and she sat on the edge of the bed with her mother's necklace in her hands, and she thought, one day at a time. That's all. Just one day at a time. She slept better than she had in months. The first week was work and nothing else. Clara rose before sunup and started the stove, and from that first hour, the kitchen became hers. Not by any declaration, she simply moved through it with the confidence of a woman who had been cooking since she was 8 years old, who knew where things ought to be and moved them there, who understood that a kitchen organized by logic was a kitchen that worked. She reorganized the shelves. She found seeds in a tin box on a high shelf, dried beans and peas, and something that might have been squash, and she took them outside and studied the empty garden plot with the appraising eye of someone trying to solve a problem. The soil was hard and pale. The summer was at its peak, and already brutal, the sun hammering down from a sky that was a color blue, Clara associated with something that had never considered compromise. Water would be the issue. She found Hector mending a fence post and asked about the well. "Good water," he said. "Deep. Never runs dry." "Good," she said. "I'm going to start a kitchen garden. I'll need help with the heavy digging." He looked at her. Then he looked at the baked earth of the garden plot. "That ground is like rock right now," he said. "I know," she said. "Which is why I'm not doing it alone." Something moved behind Hector's eyes that was not quite a smile, but was in the general neighborhood of one. He showed up after supper with a pick and a spade, and Sam came with him without being asked, and Clara worked beside them until the dark made it impossible, and her shoulders ached in a way that would make itself known very clearly the next morning. She did not complain. She simply worked. By the end of the third day, there were seeds in the ground. Caleb watched all of this without comment. He was up before she was. Each morning she'd hear his boots on the porch when she was starting the stove, and he came home last in the evenings, and he ate his supper at the table with the same quiet efficiency he seemed to bring to everything. He was not cold. He was simply contained the way a river in dry country is contained, all its force running deep and internal, not spending itself on the surface. But she noticed things. She noticed that he left fresh water on the porch steps some mornings before she was up, so she didn't have to make the walk to the well before starting the stove. She noticed that when she mentioned once, without directing it at anyone in particular, that the cracked kitchen window let in mosquitoes at night, the crack was filled with putty by the following evening. She noticed that when Pete made a comment at supper, not a cruel comment, just a thoughtless one, something about how the biscuits weren't quite like what his mother used to make, Caleb looked at Pete in a way that made Pete remember he had somewhere else to be, and no one commented on the biscuits again. She didn't acknowledge these things out loud. Neither did he. But she paid attention. It was the end of the first week when she found the garden. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been following the back fence line looking for the place Hector had mentioned where the rabbits were getting through, and she'd pushed through a section of overgrown scrub and found herself standing in a space she hadn't known existed. It was enclosed on 3 sides by the fence, and on the 4th by the barn wall, and it was entirely different from the bare utility of the rest of the ranch. Someone had planted roses here. A long time ago, from the size of the canes, thick as her wrist, in places sprawling and wild, now unpruned for years, but still producing, still pushing out blooms, despite everything. Pink ones, small, the kind Clara's grandmother had called climbers. They had gone feral. They had taken over the fence entirely and were starting on the barn wall. And in among the canes, almost invisible, were the ghost shapes of what had once been a formal planting herbs, gone to seed. Lavender run wild, a rosemary bush the size of a small cart. She stood in the middle of it for a long time. Then she went back around the barn and found Caleb at the corral, working with one of the horses on a thrown shoe. She waited until he had the shoe set before she spoke. "There's a garden behind the barn," she said, "with roses." He didn't look up right away. He set down his tools. Then he straightened and turned to her, and his expression had shifted, something that might have been called guarded in a lesser man, but in him was more like the way a person draws in before something that might hurt. "I know," he said. "It was someone's," she said, not a question. "Yes," he said. She waited. He looked at her steadily. The look said, "This is as much as I'm going to give you right now." She understood it as clearly as if he'd spoken it. "It's overgrown," she said. "The roses need cutting back. The lavender's gone to seed." She paused. "I wasn't going to touch it without asking." Something moved across his face that she couldn't name. "Leave it," he said. "Please." "Of course," she said. He nodded. He picked up his tools and went back to the horse, and she went back to the fence line to find the rabbit gap, and neither of them said anything more about it. But that night after supper, she lay in her room and thought about a garden full of roses that someone had planted with care and love, and a man who could not bring himself to go near it anymore, but also could not bring himself to let it be destroyed. And she thought, whatever happened here went deep, deeper than I know. The first twist came on a Tuesday, and it came from town. Pete rode back from Millhaven with a sack of supplies and a look on his face that said he'd heard something he wasn't sure whether to repeat. Clara was in the kitchen when he came in, and she watched him hover in the doorway for a moment before he finally said, "Ran into Galt at the store." She kept her attention on the bread she was kneading. "Did you?" "I was asking questions," Pete said. "About you. Whether you were staying, what you were doing here." He paused. "He said some things." Clara set the bread down. She turned around and looked at him. "What did he say?" Pete had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Said it wasn't right. Woman alone on a ranch with men. Said Whitmore must have taken leave of his senses. Said you probably—" He stopped. "I don't want to repeat it, ma'am. It wasn't kind." "All right," Clara said. She picked up the bread and went back to kneading. Pete stayed in the doorway. "You're not upset?" "I'm always upset by unkindness," she said. "I've just learned that reacting to it doesn't make it stop. Ignoring it doesn't either." She worked the dough in silence for a moment. "Did he say anything else?" "He said Thomas Reed was asking about Whitmore's land," Pete said. "Specifically about the water rights on the North Ridge. He said it like he was delivering news he already knew was bad." Reed's been buying up everything east of the river. Folks say he's looking west now." Clara looked up. "Who's Thomas Reed?" Pete's expression shifted into something more serious. "Biggest landowner in the county," he said. "Got a ranch 3 times the size of this one about 15 miles south. He's—" Pete searched for the word. "He's the kind of man who's always right, because he's the kind of man who makes sure other people can't afford to tell him he's wrong." Clara thought about that. "Does Mr. Whitmore know?" "Whitmore knows everything that happens in this county," Pete said. "Whether he does anything about it is another question." He left, and Clara finished the bread, and she filed the name, Thomas Reed, away, in the part of her mind where she kept things that weren't immediately her business, but might become it. That evening at supper, she watched Caleb's face when Pete mentioned Reed's name, and she saw barely, but she saw it, the faint tightening around his jaw, the way his hand stilled on the table for just a second before he picked up his fork again. She said nothing, but she kept watching. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, she made her first real mistake. She had found on a high shelf in the storeroom a collection of medicine bottles. Some of them were common laudanum calomel, the usual things a ranch kept. But some of them were more interesting dried herbs in sealed glass jars, labeled in a handwriting she didn't recognize. Chamomile valerian something labeled only as Ease Fever Cure in faded ink. She brought them to the kitchen table to examine them, because the herb jars were exactly what she'd been hoping to find, and she became absorbed in checking which ones were still good and which had dried past usefulness, and she forgot entirely about the hall. She forgot about the door. She was down the hall getting a lamp when she found herself standing in front of it, the door at the end of the east hall, the one Caleb had told her to leave closed. She hadn't been trying to reach it. She'd simply been walking down the hall in the dimming light, and there it was. She would have turned away. She was already turning away. But her lamp swung as she turned and the light caught the bottom of the door, and she saw the line of light underneath it. A faint line, pale gold, like afternoon sun coming through a curtained window. She stood very still. There was light in a room he'd told her no one went into. She stood there for 5 seconds that felt considerably longer. Then she turned and walked back to the kitchen and set the lamp on the table and told herself it was drafts. Old houses had drafts. Light behaved strangely in old houses. It wasn't her business. She was back at the medicine bottles when she heard his boots in the hall. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her, and then he looked at the bottles on the table, and he looked specifically at the jar labeled Ease Fever Cure. And his face did something complicated that lasted only a fraction of a second before it went still again. "I found these in the storeroom," she said immediately. "The herbs are still good. I was checking what could be used." "All right," he said. His voice was even. "I wasn't—" She stopped. She looked at him directly. "The door is still closed. I didn't go near it." Something moved in his eyes. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I know." He crossed to the table and looked at the bottles. He picked up the fever cure jar and looked at it for a long moment, at the label, at the handwriting, and his hand was entirely still, which Clara had come to understand was how he held things when he was very careful not to show how they affected him. "Who wrote that label?" she asked quietly. He set the jar down. "My wife," he said. The word fell into the quiet of the kitchen and sat there. Clara did not respond with condolences. She looked at him, at the way he was not looking at her, at the way he was looking at the jar, and she said, "She knew herbs. She knew everything," he said. He said it without weight, without self-pity, simply as a fact that was also somehow a grief. She could grow anything, fix anything. The garden behind the barn was hers. He said it like he'd made a decision to say it, and now that he'd said it, there was nothing else to add. "What was her name?" Clara asked. "Eleanor," he said. She nodded once. She reached out and picked up the fever cure jar and set it on the shelf with the other good ones. "If it's all right with you," she said, "I'd like to use what's still good. It would be a waste otherwise." He looked at the shelf. He looked at the jar with Eleanor's handwriting. "Use it," he said. He left the kitchen. Clara sat at the table for a long time after he was gone. She thought about a woman who had known everything. who had planted roses and labeled medicine jars in neat handwriting, who had lived in this house and been loved in it, and who was gone now. She thought about the room with the light under the door. She thought about the way Caleb had said she could grow anything like it cost him something to say it out loud. She thought he is not cold. He is simply so far inside his grief that he's forgotten there's a way out. And that thought frightened her a little, because it was not the thought you had about an employer. It was the thought you had about a person you had started to care for, and Clara Bennett had not come to Montana to care about anyone. She had come to survive. But survival, she was beginning to understand, did not always look the way you expected it to. The letter arrived on a Friday. Hector brought it in from town, a heavy cream-colored envelope addressed to Caleb Whitmore in a formal hand. Clara saw Caleb take it off the hall table, and she saw the way his expression shifted when he read the return address, and she thought, that is not good news. She was right. She found out what was in it that evening. Not because Caleb told her, he told her nothing went silent at supper, in a way that was different from his usual quiet tighter, like something wound too far, but because Pete had ridden past the south fence that afternoon and come back with information. Reed's filed a claim, Pete said low in the kitchen, while Clara was covering the leftover bread. On the water rights from the North Spring. He's saying the original deed for this land didn't include them, and he's been paying somebody at the land office to write it up official. Clara stopped. Can he do that? He's doing it, Pete said. That's not the same thing, she said. Can he do it legally? Pete shrugged the shrug of a man who has seen legal and illegal blur together enough times that he's not sure the line means anything. He's got a lawyer in Helena. Whitmore's got a ranch and a horse. Clara looked at the bread in her hands. She thought about the North Spring she'd walked up there twice with Hector checking the fencing, and she'd noticed the small wooden markers at the spring head with dates carved into them, the kind of markers a careful man puts in to establish history. Those markers, she said, at the spring, do they have dates? Going back to when Whitmore bought the place, Pete said. 83. And Reed's claim. He's saying the land sale in 83 didn't convey the water rights, saying the original owner held them separate, Clara thought. She had grown up with a lawyer in the family, her uncle, a small-town attorney back in Galesburg, who had talked about his cases at the dinner table until her aunt made him stop because it unsettled the children. Clara had always listened. She had always been interested in the way language worked, in the way a word on a piece of paper could mean the difference between what was right and what was legal, and how those two things were not always the same. I'd like to see the deed, she said. Pete blinked at her. The deed to the ranch. And whatever documentation Whitmore has from the original purchase. I'd like to read it. Why? Pete said. Because I can read, she said. And I know something about how these documents work. And because if Reed is claiming the water rights weren't included, that's a specific kind of legal argument that requires a specific kind of evidence, and the evidence either exists or it doesn't. She paused. Does Mr. Whitmore know I'm saying this? No, Pete said. Then don't tell him yet, she said. Not until I know whether it's worth saying. Pete looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the look that men got when a woman did something that didn't fit inside the space they'd assigned her in their thinking. She ignored it and went back to the bread. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her room and listened to the sounds of the ranch, the horses in the corral, the creak of the house, settling the distant call of something out in the dark. And she thought about the letter, and about Thomas Reed, and about water rights, and she thought about what Pete had said. He's got a lawyer and Helena Whitmore's got a ranch and a horse. And she thought about the way Caleb had sat at supper, not eating his food, staring at the table like a man watching something he'd built with his own hands start to come apart. She got up before dawn. She went to the kitchen and started the stove, and when the light came up she found the household files in the desk in the small room off the hall where Caleb kept his accounts. She didn't go looking for the deed. She looked for the account books first, because she'd been keeping track of the ranch's ledger for 2 weeks at Caleb's grudging request, and she knew how money flowed in this place and what it meant. The deed was in the second drawer, folded inside a leather pouch that also contained the original bill of sale and 3 years of correspondence with a land agent in Billings. She read everything. She read it twice. By the time Caleb came downstairs at 6 in the morning, she was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper where she'd written out 4 columns of notes. He stopped in the doorway. "You're up early," he said. "Sit down," she said. He looked at her. "Please," she added. He came to the table. He looked at the notes and at the deed folded beside them, and a muscle in his jaw shifted. "Pete told you," he said. "Pete told me," she confirmed. "Mr. Whitmore, your deed conveys the water rights. They're on page 3, third paragraph, explicitly described as appurtenant to the land. They were included in the sale, and there's a dated letter from your land agent confirming it." She paused. "Reed's claim is not based on a gap in your deed. It's based on a forgery, or on the hope that you won't know the difference." He stared at her. "What?" he said. "Your deed is solid," she said. "If he's claiming the rights were held separately, he would have to produce the original owner's documentation of that separation. That documentation would have had to have been filed with the Territorial Land Office in 1879, when the original patent was granted. If it wasn't filed, then it doesn't exist." She looked at him steadily. "Has Reed produced any such document?" Caleb looked at the notes in her handwriting. He looked at her face. He said, "You read the deed." "I read everything you had," she said. "I hope that's all right." He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was genuinely thinking, not shutting her out. "How do you know this?" he said. "My uncle was a lawyer," she said. "He talked too much at dinner for 18 years. I paid attention." She paused. "I'm not a lawyer, but I can read a legal document and tell you what it says and what it doesn't say, and what yours says is that you own that water." He looked at the deed for a long moment. Then he looked at her, and his expression was doing something she hadn't seen on it before. Something opening something that the careful guardedness he kept in place most of the time hadn't quite managed to close off in time. "Clara," he said. He said her name differently than he said anything else deliberate, like he'd weighed it before setting it down. "Why are you doing this?" She looked at him. She thought about the question and gave it the honest answer. "Because it's your ranch," she said. "And it's right. And because I know what it looks like when someone tries to take something from a person by counting on them not to know better." She looked down at her notes. "I've had people count on that with me." He was quiet. "You should telegraph your land agent in Billings," she said, returning to the practical, because the practical was safer. "Ask him to pull his copies of the sale documents. And you should write to the Territorial Land Office and request the original patent records. Reed can't fight that if the record shows no separate filing." She paused. "It will take time, but it will hold." He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at the deed. Then he looked at her with an expression that was not quite the careful measuring look he usually wore. This was something different, something she didn't have a name for yet. "You've been here 3 weeks," he said. "I know," she said. "You've reorganized my kitchen, started a garden and ground I thought was dead fixed. The fence on the east side, found a rabbit gap Pete's been ignoring for 6 months. The rabbits were eating the new seedlings," she said. "It was urgent. And now you've read my legal documents and told me how to fight a land claim." "I found the rabbit gap while I was looking for something else," she said. "The legal documents I looked at on purpose." He almost smiled. It was the closest she had seen to it, a slight change in the lines around his eyes, a softening at the corner of his mouth that came and went before it fully arrived. "You said you could keep people alive," he said. "When I asked if you could cook, back in Millhaven." "I remember," she said. He nodded slowly. He picked up the deed. He looked at it for a moment, then set it down with the care of a man who has just been given something back that he thought he'd lost. "I'll ride to the telegraph office this afternoon," he said. "Good," she said. She got up to start breakfast because there was work to be done, and she had already sat still long enough. But she was aware of him sitting there at the table, looking at the deed and then at the notes she'd written, and she was aware of the shift in the air between them. Nothing dramatic. Nothing named, just a small and careful opening, like a window raised an inch on a still morning. Outside, the sun was just coming over the ridge. The garden seeds she had planted 3 weeks ago were beginning impossibly stubbornly to push through the baked earth. and in the kitchen of a house that had been silent for too long. Two people sat together in the early morning and let the quiet between them mean something different than it had before. The telegraph came back from Billings in 4 days. Caleb read it at the kitchen table while Clara was rolling out biscuit dough, and she knew from the way he set the paper down carefully, precisely, the way he set things down when he was controlling something, that it was not the answer he'd wanted. The land agent's records were destroyed, he said. Fire in his office, last spring. Clara stopped rolling. All of them. Everything from 80 to 85. He looked at the paper. He says he remembers the sale clearly. He says the water rights were absolutely conveyed, but he has nothing to show it. Clara set down the rolling pin. She thought about what this meant, and she thought about it quickly, because there wasn't time to be slow. "The Territorial Land Office," she said. "I told you to write to them." "I did," he said. "Same day." He paused. "That one hasn't come back yet." "Then we wait," she said. "The original patent records are in Helena. They don't burn easily. The land office is stone construction, fireproof cabinets. If the separate filing doesn't exist, the record will show it." She held his gaze. "Reed can't manufacture a document that was never filed, not if the office has clean records." "And if someone's already gotten to the land office," Caleb said. The question sat between them. Clara picked up the rolling pin again because her hands needed something to do when her mind was working. "Then we find another way," she said. "But we don't assume the worst until we know it's the worst." He looked at her for a moment. "You always do that," he said. "Do what?" "Find the next step," he said, "before the first one's even finished failing." She glanced at him. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. "It's not." She cut the biscuits and put them in the pan and said nothing more, but she felt his eyes on her back for a long moment before he folded the telegram and put it in his shirt pocket and went back outside. That afternoon, Thomas Reed rode on to the property. Clara heard the horse before she saw him, heard Amos bark, which Amos almost never did, and heard Hector's voice from the yard, low and tight, in a way that made her set down the knife she was using and wipe her hands and go to the back door. Reed was exactly what Pete had described, which was to say, he was the physical embodiment of a man who had never been told no by anyone who could make it stick. He was perhaps 50, well-fed in the specific way of men who eat well, because other people's hunger makes it possible, with a gray suit that was expensive and a hat that was newer than anyone else's in the county. He rode a horse that was worth more than some ranches. He sat on it, like he sat on everything, like it was already his. Caleb was standing in the yard. He had come from the barn, and he still had a coil of rope in one hand, and he hadn't put it down, which Clara understood was deliberate. He was not going to make this look like a formal meeting. "Whitmore," Reed said from horseback. He didn't dismount. Men like Reed, Clara had learned from her uncle's dinner table stories, didn't dismount when they wanted to remind you of the difference between your position and theirs. "Reed," Caleb said, "you're on my land." "That's exactly what I'm here to discuss," Reed said pleasantly. The pleasantness was a performance. She could hear it from the doorway. "I think there may be some confusion about the boundaries of what's yours and what isn't." "There's no confusion on my end," Caleb said. Reed smiled. It did not reach his eyes, which were the flat, patient eyes of a man who has learned that patience is the most efficient form of cruelty. "I've filed a formal claim with the Territorial Land Office," he said. "You'll be receiving official notification. I just thought, neighbor to neighbor, I'd extend the courtesy of a conversation first." He paused. "Before the lawyers make everything complicated." "The lawyers," Caleb said, "are going to find my deed says exactly what I know it says." "Deeds are interesting documents," Reed said. "They say a great deal, but what they don't say is sometimes just as important." He looked past Caleb, looked past him, deliberately toward the house, toward where Clara was standing in the doorway. His eyes settled on her with an expression that was not hostile exactly, but was the specific kind of dismissive that was designed to be noticed. "I heard you'd hired someone," he said. "A woman. Came in on the stage from somewhere back east." Caleb didn't turn around. He didn't look at Clara. He kept his eyes on Reed with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who is very good at not giving people what they're looking for. My household is my business, he said. Of course, Reed said. He gathered his reins. I'll let you get back to your day. Think about what I said, Whitmore. It would be a shame to let lawyers and courts eat up what's left of a struggling ranch. He said, struggling with great care, like he'd chosen it specifically. There are easier ways to settle these things, man to man. Write to my land agent, Caleb said. In Billings. Reed's expression flickered, just for a second. His record's burned, he said. I know, Caleb said. Write to him anyway. Reed looked at him for a moment that lasted slightly too long. Then he turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, and the yard was quiet, except for Amos, who stood watching the retreating horse with a low sustained sound in his chest that was not quite a growl. Caleb stood in the yard until Reed was out of sight. Then he turned. Clara met his eyes from the doorway. He knew about the Billings records, she said. Yes, Caleb said. That's not a coincidence. No, he said. It's not. He came to the back door and stopped at the bottom step and looked up at her. This close, she could see what the controlled expression was covering, not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. Something heavier than anger. The look of a man watching something he loves being threatened by a force he can't simply outwork. Clara, he said, I need you to tell me honestly. Can we fight this? She looked at him. She thought about the deed and the patent records and the land agent's burned files and the way Reed had said struggling like he already knew the outcome. Yes, she said, but it's going to take more than I can do alone. She paused. Do you trust me to handle the documentation side of this? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I trusted you with my kitchen after knowing you for 30 minutes. I think we're past the point of that question. She almost smiled. All right, she said. Then let me work. She wrote letters for the next 3 evenings after supper. She wrote to the Territorial Land Office in Helena, directly citing specific sections of territorial statute regarding water rights conveyance using language she'd found in one of her uncle's old reference books, a battered volume called Territorial Property Law, 1879 edition that she'd carried from Galesburg because her uncle had pressed it into her hands the day she left and said, You never know when you'll need to know what belongs to you. She wrote to the county recorder in Mill Haven, requesting copies of all recorded instruments related to the original land patent. She wrote to a lawyer in Billings whose name she'd found in the correspondence file, a man named Archibald Crane, who had apparently handled several neighboring ranches' legal matters, and she laid out the situation in plain language and asked what it would cost to have him review the title chain. Caleb sat across the table from her on the second evening and watched her write. He didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He simply sat with his coffee and watched her work with an expression she had stopped trying to name and had started simply accepting as something real. You write like someone who's done this before, he said when she set down her pen. I've written enough letters on behalf of people who couldn't, she said. My mother, neighbors, people who needed things said in the right way and didn't know how. She capped the ink. Language is a tool. Most people don't realize how much power they give away by not knowing how to use it. Where'd you learn? Reading, she said. Listening. Paying attention when men in rooms decided I wasn't worth being careful around. She looked at him directly. People say a great deal when they think no one important is listening. Something moved in his face. You've had a harder life than you let on, he said. Harder than some, she said. Easier than others. She stacked the letters. It doesn't matter. What matters is what you do with it. Howe was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, tell me something about your mother. She looked up at him. He wasn't looking away. He was looking at her with an openness that was rare on his face, the expression of a man who has decided to ask a real question and means to hear a real answer. She was practical, Clara said. She didn't waste anything, not food, not words, not time. She used to say that sentiment is fine, but competence saves lives. She paused. She was also the most loving person I've ever known. Those things were not a contradiction for her. Caleb nodded slowly. Like what she'd said had landed somewhere real. Eleanor was the opposite, he said, and Clara heard him catch himself, heard the slight pause that followed Eleanor's name, the way he did every time, that fractional hesitation. But this time, he kept going. Everything was full with her. She laughed loud. She cried easily. She grew those roses because she said a home needed something beautiful that wasn't useful. He looked at the table. I used to think that was extravagant. Now I think I didn't understand what useful meant. Clara didn't speak for a moment. How long ago? She said quietly. 4 years, he said. Winter fever. I was out on the north pasture when it took her. He paused. She was gone before I got back. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm sorry, Clara said. She said it simply, without performance, without the excessive softness that people sometimes used around grief, as if volume would help. Just the words, plain and meant. He nodded. He looked at the letters she'd written. You should sleep, he said. You've been up late 3 nights running. So have you, she said. I don't sleep. She looked at him. He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said most things, not asking for sympathy, simply reporting. But she heard what was underneath it: 4 years of nights in a house that had too much quiet in it. Neither do I, she said. But I'm learning. She gathered the letters and went to her room, and she lay in the dark and thought about a woman named Eleanor, who had planted roses and made fever cures and laughed loud in this house. And she thought about the man in the kitchen who was learning 4 years too late how to say her name out loud again. And she thought, be careful, Clara. Be very careful. She pressed her mother's necklace against her palm and listened to the house settle around her and told herself she knew exactly what she was doing here and why. She was not entirely sure she believed it. The response from Helena came on a Wednesday, and it changed everything. Caleb brought it to this kitchen at noon, and she knew before he opened his mouth that it was bad, because he'd come straight from the road without stopping to put his horse up, which he never did. The land office in Helena, he said. They wrote back. He set the letter on the table. Clara read it standing up. The Territorial Land Office had received her inquiry. They had reviewed the original patent records for the Whitmore property. They had found, filed in August of 1879, a document from the original landowner stipulating that the water rights to the North Spring were reserved separately from the land sale and had never been conveyed. The document was signed. It was dated. It was officially recorded. Clara read it twice. She read it a third time. This is a forgery, she said. Caleb looked at her. This document did not exist when I wrote to them, she said. It was not in the records when the sale was made in '83. If it had been, your land agent would have flagged it. The sale would not have gone through on the terms it did. She laid the letter flat. Someone put this in the records between when I wrote my letter and when they responded. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Reed, Caleb said. Reed has someone inside the land office, she said. Or he had someone get to the records before the clerk looked. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She was angry, genuinely, cleanly angry, in a way that felt clarifying rather than overwhelming. He knew we were asking. He knew the Billings records were gone. He had time to put something in place. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. He looked like a man who had been walking uphill for a long time and has just been told the hill is taller than he thought. What do we do? He said. We challenge it, she said. A document filed in August of '79 would have specific characteristics. The paper, the ink, the recording clerk's signature. There would have been a clerk in Helena in '79, and that clerk either signed this document or didn't, and if they didn't, we can prove it. She paused. I need Archibald Crane, the lawyer in Billings. I need to know if he can get someone into that land office to examine the original document. That takes money, Caleb said, and time. I know, she said. How much time do we have before Reed can act on this? He'd have to take it to a territorial judge, Caleb said. 30 days, maybe 40 before a hearing. Then we have 40 days, she said, and we are going to use every one of them. He looked at her. He looked at this woman who had come to his ranch 6 weeks ago with 6 cents and a cracked suitcase and a necklace she'd tried to sell to a man who told her it was worthless, and who was now sitting across from him planning a legal strategy with the focused intensity of someone who has decided that losing is simply not among the available options. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said, without knowing entirely what she was telling him not to do. "Just tell me you're going to fight this." "I'm going to fight this," he said. "Good," she said. "Then let's start." The next 3 weeks were the hardest of her time at the ranch. She wrote to Crane in Billings, and he wrote back within the week a short business-like letter that said he had seen similar situations before, that he believed the document could be challenged on procedural grounds, and that his fee would be $60 half in advance. $60 was more than Clara made in 4 months. Caleb paid it without visible hesitation, and she understood from that single act that whatever the ranch's financial pressures, he was not a man who did things halfway once he'd decided to do them. She wrote to 3 other ranchers in the county, men whose names she'd found in Caleb's correspondence files, men who had dealt with Reed before, and she asked them what they knew and what they'd seen. 2 of them wrote back. Their letters were careful. The letters of men who had learned to be careful about putting anything in writing where Reed might eventually read it. But between the careful lines, there was enough to see the shape of what Reed had been doing for years. Slow accumulation, boundary by boundary water, right by water, right, a patient campaign to own everything in this valley. Caleb read her summaries of these letters every evening. He read them with the focus of a man building something in his mind, assembling pieces, and she watched his expression shift from the heavy stoic endurance of the first weeks into something sharper and more forward-facing. He was not a man who rallied easily or dramatically, but he was rallying. And then, on a Thursday evening in the 6th week of Clara's time at the ranch, everything shifted in a direction she had not anticipated. She was in the rose garden. She'd gone there the way she sometimes went. Not to touch it, not to change it, simply to check whether the old plants needed water. The roses were managing on their own, as they had been for 4 years, with the stubborn vitality of something that was grown by a person who loved it well, and had rooted deeply enough to keep going without them. But something had gotten into the lavender, a blight she thought the kind that spread, and she'd been watching it for a week. She was crouched down, examining the base of the lavender when she heard him. Caleb came around the barn and stopped when he saw her. She looked up. He looked at her, and at the garden around her, and at the roses, and she saw on his face the same thing she always saw when he came close to this space, that complex, careful grief. But this time, there was something else in it too. Something that was watching her specifically, not the garden. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to stand. "I can go?" "No," he said. "Stay." She stayed. He came through the gap in the fence and stood in the middle of the garden the first time she realized that she had ever seen him inside it. He stood very still, looking at the roses, and she said nothing, because this was not a moment for words. After a long time, he said, "She planted these the first summer we were here." "They're beautiful," Clara said simply. "They got wild," he said. I couldn't bring myself to cut them back, after." "Wild suits them," she said. "Some things grow better without too much managing." He looked at her. She hadn't meant anything by it. She'd been looking at the roses when she said it. But she could feel his eyes on her face, and when she looked up, he was watching her with an expression she could not file away into the categories she'd been using. "Hector told me," he said, "that you fixed the east fence yourself, 2 sections of it. Didn't ask anyone for help." "I've fixed fence before," she said. "He also told me you sat with the roan mare for 2 nights last week when she was colicking," he said. "He didn't tell me because I asked. He told me because he wanted me to know." Clara looked at her hands. "She was in pain," she said. "I couldn't leave her." "No," he said quietly. "You couldn't." He paused. "You can't leave anything that's struggling, can you?" She looked up. I was not smiling. But his face had opened in a way she had not seen before, all of the careful management of his expression gone, or at least lowered, and underneath it something that was both simpler and more complicated than anything she'd been prepared for. "Caleb," she started. "I know," he said. "I know what I said about the door, about not—" He stopped. He looked at the roses again. "I've been keeping that room locked for 4 years," he said. "I told myself it was because I wasn't ready. That's what I told myself. She waited. I think, he said slowly, I was afraid that if I opened it, it would mean she was really gone. And if she was really gone, then I had to figure out who I was without her. He paused. And I didn't know if there was anyone in there worth finding. The garden was very quiet. There is, Clara said. He looked at her. I've watched you for 6 weeks, she said, and her voice was steady because she needed it to be steady, because this mattered, and she was not going to let it wobble. I've watched you with your men and your horses and your land. You're fair. You're honest. You work harder than anyone else on this property, and you never make a point of it. You keep your word. She paused. When Galt laughed at me in that store, you didn't make a speech. You just paid, and you asked if I could cook. That's who you are. He looked at her for a long moment. Then Thomas Reed's man rode through the gate. Clara heard the hoofbeats first, a single horse fast coming in from the south road. She was still in the rose garden. Caleb turned toward the sound, and both of them came back around the barn into the yard just as the rider pulled up. It was Reed's foreman, a man named Briggs, whom Clara had seen once in town, a lean, watchful man, with the look of someone permanently employed in tasks he knew were on the wrong side of something. Whitmore, Briggs said. He wasn't looking at Caleb. He was looking toward the south road, and his expression was wrong-taught in a way that wasn't about confrontation. What? Caleb said. Reed, Briggs said. He was moving cattle across the river crossing South End. Wagon went over. River's running high from last week's rain. He's... Briggs paused like the words were costing him. He's pinned under the wagon. In the water. My boys can't get to him, the current's bad, and we're short on men. The yard went silent. Clara looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Briggs. You're asking me, Caleb said. It was not quite a question. You've got 4 men, and you've got the block and tackle on the big barn, Briggs said. He had the expression of a man who has swallowed every feeling he has about this situation and is simply reporting facts because that is the only way to get through the next 60 seconds. I don't have anywhere else to go. Clara watched Caleb's face. She watched him take in what was being asked, ride to the aid of the man who had forged documents against him, who had been systematically trying to take his land, who had looked at Clara in her doorway with that dismissive proprietary gaze. She watched him think, and then she saw him not think anymore. Hector, he shouted, already turning toward the barn. Pete, get the block and tackle and the heavy rope. Now. Briggs let out a breath like a man released from something. Caleb looked at Clara. Just for a second. And in that second, something passed between them that neither of them spoke. She saw it in his eyes, the acknowledgement of what this was, what it cost, what it meant about who he was. She saw it, and he saw that she saw it. Stay here, he said. Like hell, she said. She was already getting her medical bag. The river crossing was 20 minutes hard ride south, and Clara made it on the spare horse because Hector took one look at her medical bag and pulled the animal out of the corral without being asked. The sound reached them before they arrived, the river running high and brown over the crossing rocks and men shouting, and underneath it, the sound of something large and stuck. Reed's wagon had gone over sideways into the shallower edge of the crossing, and the current had it pinned against a rock formation, with Reed trapped beneath the forward wheel, half in the water, his head up but barely. He was conscious. From the look on his face, he had been conscious long enough to understand exactly how bad his situation was. Caleb assessed it in about 30 seconds. He directed Hector and Pete with the block and tackle. He sent Sam downstream with a rope as a safety line, and he went into the water himself up to his chest to get the chain under the axle, because none of the other men were quite tall enough to manage it against the current. Clara watched this from the bank, and she prepared what she could, because a man who had been pinned under water and cold weight for any length of time would need specific things in a specific order. It took 20 minutes, and it was not clean. There was a moment when the wagon shifted wrong, and everyone went still, and Clara stopped breathing, and then Hector and Pete hauled on the block and tackle with everything they had, and the wagon moved, and Briggs and 2 of Reed's men pulled Reed clear. Howe was alive. His left leg was broken badly, she could tell from the angle before she even touched it, and he had 2 cracked ribs from the weight, and he was cold and frightened in the particular way that men who are never frightened look when fear catches them. Clara came down the bank. She knelt beside Reed in the mud of the riverbank in her second-best dress, with the small white buttons she'd mended twice at the collar, and she did what she had been doing since she was old enough to be trusted with it. She assessed, she worked, she kept someone alive. Reed looked at her. He looked at her face, close the face of the woman he'd looked past in Caleb's doorway, with his flat proprietary eyes. "You're the woman from the ranch," he said. His voice was thin. "Yes," she said. She was setting the leg. "Don't move." "Whitmore came," Reed said. Not like he was surprised, like he was saying something out loud that he was processing for the first time. "Yes," she said again. "Why?" Reed said. Clara looked up at him. She thought about what Caleb had said about fairness. She thought about her mother's voice, saying competence saves lives. She thought about everything Thomas Reed had done and was still doing and would continue to do if no one stopped him. She looked him in the eye. "Because that's who he is," she said. "Not who you thought he was, who he actually is." Reed was quiet for a moment. His jaw was tight with pain. His eyes were doing something that was not the performance she'd seen at the ranch. Something real was happening in them. Caleb came up the bank. He was soaked to the chest river mud on his hands, and he looked at Reed on the ground and at Clara working, and he said nothing. He just stood there and let Clara work and made sure she had what she needed. When it was done, the leg splinted the ribs bound. Reed stabilized enough to move. Clara sat back on her heels and looked up at Caleb. He looked down at her. Between them was the river sound and the smell of mud and the particular quality of light at the end of a day that has taken everything from both of them and given something back in a form neither had expected. "Thank you," Reed said, to both of them. Neither of them responded right away. Then Caleb said, "Get him back to his ranch. He needs a doctor tonight, not tomorrow." He reached down and offered Clara his hand. She took it and stood, and he held it 1 second longer than necessary, and she felt the roughness of his palm against hers, and the warmth of it after the cold air of the river. And then he released her and turned toward the horses. Clara looked at Thomas Reed one more time. Reed was looking at her with the expression of a man seeing something clearly for the first time after a long period of looking at it wrong. She picked up her medical bag. She walked toward her horse. Behind her she heard Reed say something to Briggs in a low voice. She couldn't make out the words, but she heard the tone of it, and the tone was not what she would have expected from Thomas Reed. It was quiet. It was something that sounded improbably like a beginning. The sun was going down behind the mountains as they rode back north, and the sky was doing what Montana skies did at that hour, turning colors that had no business existing, that looked like something a person made up to describe an emotion they didn't have words for. Clara rode beside Caleb and said nothing. He said nothing. But his hand where it rested on the saddle horn was close to hers on the reins, and neither of them moved away. They rode back in silence, and the silence was different from any silence that had existed between them before. It wasn't the silence of two strangers sharing a wagon seat. It wasn't the careful quiet of an employer and his hired cook moving around each other in a kitchen. It was the silence of two people who had just stood in the same cold river mud and done the same hard thing and come out the other side still standing, and neither of them quite knew what to do with that yet. Hector and Pete rode ahead. Sam followed at a distance with the equipment. Clara and Caleb came last, and the space between their horses was exactly the space it always was, and both of them were very aware of it. When they reached the ranch, Caleb took her horse without asking and led both animals to the corral. Clara went inside, washed the river mud off her hands and arms at the kitchen basin, and put the kettle on because the evening had gone cold and she needed something to do with her hands, while her mind sorted through everything that had happened in the last 3 hours. She heard him come in. She heard him stop in the doorway. "How are you?" he said. "Fine," she said automatically. "Clara." She turned around. He was leaning against the doorframe, still damp at the collar and cuffs, and he was looking at her with the expression that she had stopped trying to file away into safe categories, the one that was careful and open at the same time, the one that cost him something to let her see. "I'm shaken," she said honestly. "The leg was bad. If we'd gotten there 20 minutes later, he would have gone under. I know, Caleb said. You went in the water yourself, she said. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, he said simply. She looked at him. He's been trying to take your land. I know what he's been doing, Caleb said. He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table, and he sat with his elbows on the wood and his hands loose in front of him, not wound tight the way they'd been for weeks. Something had come loose in him at that river. She could see it. Doesn't mean I let a man drown, he said. Doesn't matter who he is. The kettle started to sound. She made the coffee and set a cup in front of him and sat down across the table. What happens now, she said. With Reed, with the claim. I don't know, he said. Crane wrote back, I got the letter this afternoon before Briggs wrote in. He says he's found something in the Helena records. Something about the recording clerk's signature on the filed document. He paused. The clerk who supposedly signed it in 79 died in 77. Clara stared at him. The signature on the document is forged, Caleb said. Crane is filing a motion to have it invalidated. Clara sat back in her chair. She breathed. She felt something release in her chest that had been wound tight for 3 weeks without her fully realizing how tight it had gotten. It's over, she said. Not yet, he said. There'll be a hearing. But Crane says with a forged clerk's signature, Reed's claim has no foundation. It'll be thrown out. He looked at his coffee. Reed will know by morning that we found it. Briggs will tell him tonight. Good, Clara said. And then before she could think better of it, does that feel like enough, knowing it'll be thrown out? He looked at her. What do you mean? I mean. She paused, organizing it. He forged documents. He tried to take what was yours, and now he's going to lose in a hearing and go back to his ranch and live his life. She looked at her cup. Does that feel like justice to you? Caleb was quiet for a moment. I've thought about that, he said. What I'd do if I had Reed in a position where I could make it worse for him than a hearing. He looked at his hands. I decided I didn't want to be that person. Why not, she said, and she meant it as a real question, not a challenge. Because I'd have to live with it, he said. And I've already got enough things I carry around that I'd rather set down. He looked at her directly. The hearing is enough. The land stays mine. That's what matters. Clara held that. Then she nodded. All right, she said. All right, he said. They drank their coffee, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the Montana dark had settled completely over the valley, and Clara thought, this is what it feels like when something starts to be okay. She wasn't sure she'd felt it before. She wanted to be careful with it. Reed sent a letter 3 days later. It came addressed to both of them, to Caleb Whitmore and Miss Clara Bennett, which was unusual enough that Clara turned the envelope over twice before opening it. Inside was a single page in Reed's precise handwriting. She read it at the kitchen table, and then she read it again, and then she handed it to Caleb. He read it standing up. Mr. Whitmore and Miss Bennett, it began. I am writing from my bed where I expect to remain for some weeks. I want to be direct about several matters. The claim I filed against your water rights was based on a document I knew to be fraudulent. I authorized its creation and its filing. I am instructing my attorney to withdraw the claim immediately and unconditionally. You will receive formal written notification of the withdrawal within the week. I am also writing to say, and I recognize this does not cover the harm I intended, that I was wrong in what I did and in how I conducted myself. You came to my aid when any reasonable man in your position would not have. You sent your woman to treat my injuries with the same care she would have given a friend. I don't know how to account for that, except to say it showed me something about myself that I did not enjoy seeing. I don't expect forgiveness. I am not certain I would offer it in your position. But I am asking that you accept my withdrawal of the claim and my acknowledgement of my conduct as what it is, an honest reckoning. Thomas Reed. Caleb lowered the letter. Clara watched his face. He set the letter on the table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, He called you my woman. Clara blinked. Out of everything in that letter, she had not expected that to be the first thing he addressed. He did, she said carefully. Caleb looked at her. The careful, open expression was there, and underneath it, something she had been watching build for weeks, Something she had been telling herself she was imagining, because it was safer to believe she was imagining it. "Is that all right?" he said. The question was so quiet she almost didn't hear it. She looked at him across the table. She thought about 6 cents and a cracked suitcase and a man who had put money on a counter without being asked and said a person ought to be able to ask for fairness. She thought about mornings with the stove and evenings at the table and the rose garden and the letter she'd written to the land office and the river mud on her dress. She thought about all of it, and she said nothing for long enough that she saw something shift in his expression, something beginning to close. "Yes," she said. "It's all right." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once and picked up his coffee cup and went back to whatever he'd been thinking about before the letter arrived, and Clara went back to what she'd been doing, and neither of them said anything more about it. But the kitchen felt different after that. Warmer, maybe. Or perhaps it had always been warm, and she had only now allowed herself to feel it. The withdrawal came through on a Friday. Crane sent a telegram and then a letter, and the letter confirmed that the forged document had been flagged for investigation by the Territorial Land Office, that the clerk whose signature had been used dead since 1877 could not obviously have signed anything in 1879, and that Reed's attorney had filed the withdrawal without contest. Caleb read the letter at the kitchen table on a Friday morning and set it down and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "It's done." Clara set a plate of biscuits on the table and sat down. "Yes," she said. He looked at her across the table. "You did this," he said. "You fought it," she said. "I just read the documents." Clara. He said her name with the same deliberateness he always used, like he'd chosen it specifically. "I had those documents for 4 years. I didn't read them the way you did. I didn't know what to look for." He paused. "You knew." "My uncle talked too much at dinner," she said. "Stop deflecting," he said quietly. She looked at him. She pressed her lips together. "All right," she said. "I helped. I'm glad it worked." "More than glad," he said. "I want you to know." He stopped. He looked at the table. He was not a man who said things like this easily. She knew that about him, now knew it the way you know the geography of a place you've lived in for a while, the way you know where the uneven boards are, and which door sticks in wet weather. "I want you to know that what you've done here for this ranch for me, I don't take it for nothing. I know you came here for work. I know you had nowhere else to go that first day." He looked up. "But you didn't have to do half of what you've done, and I see that." Clara sat with that. She let it land properly instead of deflecting it. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it." He nodded. He picked up a biscuit. He looked at it. Then he said, "I'm going to open the room today." She looked at him. "Eleanor's room," he said. "I've been thinking about it since—" He paused. "Since the garden. Since the river. I've been thinking about it." He set the biscuit down. "I think I've been keeping it closed like it was protecting something. Like if I left everything exactly where she put it, she'd still be in there somewhere." Clara was very still. "She's not in there," he said. It cost him. She could hear it. "She hasn't been for 4 years, and I've been treating that room like a shrine and letting it eat me alive instead of—" He stopped. "Instead of living," Clara said softly. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "Do you want company?" she said. "Or do you want to do it alone?" He thought about it seriously. "I think I need to go in alone first," he said. "But I'd—" He stopped again, and she watched him navigate toward something that didn't come naturally. "I'd like you to be nearby." "I'll be in the kitchen," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He nodded. He got up from the table. He walked to the hall. She heard his footsteps stop. She heard the sound of a key. He had carried it in his pocket for 4 years. She realized never using it, never losing it either. She heard the door open. Then silence. She sat at the kitchen table, and she was very quiet, and she did not go to him. She had said she would be in the kitchen, and she stayed in the kitchen, and she sat with her coffee and her own thoughts, and she gave him the time he needed. After 20 minutes, she heard him come back down the hall. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. His eyes were red at the edges, which was the only sign, and it was a small one. His expression was not shattered. It was not relieved. It was something in between the specific look of a person who has done something necessary and hard and is still standing on the other side of it. He sat down at the table. She poured him coffee without asking. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at it. "There's a rocking chair in there," he said. "She used to sit in it in the evenings." He paused. "I forgot about the rocking chair." Clara said nothing. She let him have the moment. "She had a book open on the table," he said. "Still there. Still open to the same page." He exhaled. 4 years. "What was she reading?" Clara asked quietly. He almost smiled. "Dickens," he said. "She loved Dickens. She used to read passages aloud at dinner and act out all the voices, and I used to pretend it annoyed me." He looked at his cup. "I didn't actually find it annoying." Clara smiled at her own cup. "No," she said. "I don't imagine you did." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I put the book on the shelf," he said. "And I opened the curtains." He paused. "It needed air." "It did," she said. "I'm going to move some things," he said. "Not remove them, just—" he searched for the word. "Arrange them so they're honored but not frozen. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," she said. He looked at her. His eyes were still red at the edges, but they were clear. "You know what she'd have said about you," he said. Clara shook her head. "She'd have said—" He paused, and something moved across his face that was grief and something else at the same time. "She'd have said you were exactly the kind of woman this ranch needed, and she'd have meant it as the highest possible compliment." He held Clara's gaze. Eleanor didn't give compliments lightly. Clara's throat was tight. She pressed her lips together. "She sounds like someone I would have liked," she said. "She would have liked you too," he said, loudly. "She would have told you so about 6 times." That made Clara laugh, a small, genuine sound that surprised her. He smiled at the sound, and it was the first full smile she had seen on him, and it changed his whole face. The way a window opened in a closed room changes the air of it entirely. She thought, there he is. The person who had been in there the whole time behind the careful distance and the locked doors and the 4 years of grief. There he is. She did not say that out loud, but she thought it with a completeness that she felt in her chest. Pete came in that afternoon with news from town that shifted the ground under them one more time. He came into the kitchen with his hat in his hands and an expression that said he wasn't sure whether what he had to say was good news or something else, and he stood in the doorway until Clara looked up and said, "Just say it, Pete." "Reed's in town," Pete said. "At the saloon. He's been there most of the afternoon." He paused. "He's been talking." Caleb came in from the hall. "Talking about what?" Pete looked at him. "About the land claim," he said. "About the document. He's been telling people, anyone who'd listen, that he filed a fraudulent claim against you. He's not saying it was a mistake or that he was misled. He's saying he did it on purpose and that he was wrong." Pete shifted his weight. Galt was there, half the town council. He paused. Reverend Cole. The kitchen was quiet. "He's confessing," Clara said. "Publicly," Pete said. Caleb looked at Clara. Clara looked at Caleb. "He doesn't have to do that," Caleb said. "The withdrawal covered him legally. He could have lived the rest of his life in Millhaven without ever saying another word about it." "No," Clara said. "He doesn't." "Why is he?" Caleb said. But the way he said it, she thought he already knew the answer, or at least suspected it. She thought about Reed on the riverbank. She thought about the look in his eyes when Caleb came up out of the water, and when she'd set his broken leg without asking him whether he deserved it. She thought about what she'd said, "That's who he is. Not who you thought he was, who he actually is." "Because someone showed him what it looked like to do the right thing," she said. "And he couldn't unfeel it." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll ride to town tomorrow." "Why?" she said. "Because if he's going to stand up in public and say what he did," Caleb said, "the least I can do is be there when he says it, so he knows I heard him." Clara looked at him. She thought about the word fair and everything it had come to mean in this house over the past 2 months. "I'll come with you," she said. He held her gaze. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. They rode to Millhaven the next morning, and the day was clear and already hot, and Clara wore her blue cotton dress and her good boots with the cracked heel that she still hadn't found money to repair, and Caleb rode beside her on the road, and the space between their horses was slightly smaller than it had ever been. She noticed. She thought he noticed too. Neither of them commented. Reed was at the hotel, not the saloon. He'd been moved there after his afternoon of public reckoning. Reckoning Briggs had managed that much. Clara and Caleb went to the hotel and were shown to Reed's room, and Clara waited in the hallway while Caleb went in alone, because this was between the two men first, and she knew it. She stood in the corridor for about 10 minutes. She could hear the low rumble of voices through the door, not the words, just the tone of them, and the tone was not hostile. It was two people talking the way people talk when they've moved past fighting into something more difficult and more real. When Caleb came out, he pulled the door closed behind him and stood in the corridor for a moment with his hand on the doorframe. Clara looked at him. "He's going to deed the north quarter section to the county," Caleb said, "for public grazing, his way of," he paused, "making something right that he can actually make right." "That's significant," Clara said. "Yes," he said. He looked at the closed door. He also said, he stopped, started again. "He asked me how a man starts over," Caleb said, "after he's been the wrong kind of person for a long time." Clara was quiet. "I told him I thought it started with one honest thing," Caleb said, "and then another one after that." He looked at her. "I don't know if I gave him good advice." "You gave him true advice," she said. "That's better." He pushed away from the doorframe. They walked down the corridor toward the stairs, and in the lobby, Galt was there behind the front desk, apparently doing some business with the hotel owner, and he looked up when they came down the stairs. He looked at Clara first. And then, with the particular discomfort of a man who is being forced by circumstances to revise his assessment of something, he looked at Caleb. He said nothing. He simply gave Clara a short, stiff nod. The kind of nod that costs a person something. Clara nodded back. She did not smile. She did not say anything. She simply accepted it as what it was, a small grudging acknowledgement from a man who had laughed at her in public 2 months ago, and she walked past him and out into the street. Caleb came out behind her. "That," he said, "must have hurt him considerably." "Good," she said, and then immediately, "That was unkind." "It was honest," he said. "Those aren't always different things." She laughed. It surprised her again, the ease of it. She was laughing more in this place than she had in years, and she was only now beginning to understand that this was something worth noticing. They walked down the main street of Millhaven, and people noticed them. She was aware of it. The way a few of the women outside the dry goods store watched them pass. She was aware that she had gone from being the woman nobody wanted to being someone in this town, someone attached to a name that meant something, and she did not know entirely how she felt about that. It was better than what she'd had before. It was also not entirely hers. She stopped in front of the general store. Caleb stopped beside her. She looked at the storefront and thought about the day she'd stood in there with her mother's necklace and 6 cents and the certainty that she had nowhere left to go. "What?" Caleb said. "Nothing," she said. "Just thinking about the first time I came here." He looked at the store. He looked at her. "You're not that woman anymore," he said. "I'm exactly that woman," she said. "That's the point." She turned to look at him. She didn't change. The circumstances did. She was always... She stopped. She pressed her hand against the front of her dress against the necklace. She was always worth something. She just needed a place where that was allowed to be true. Caleb looked at her with that full, open look, the one that had started appearing more and more often over the past weeks, the one she had stopped pretending she wasn't affected by. "This is a place where it's allowed to be true," he said. She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm still here." The words landed between them and settled, and she felt them settle, felt the weight of what they actually meant against what they technically said, and she saw him feel it too. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't say anything else. He simply stood beside her on the main street of Millhaven, in the July heat, close enough that his arm was near hers, and they both looked at the store for a moment. Then she said, "I need to get thread from the dry goods store. My collar isn't going to hold another mending." "All right," he said. He fell into step beside her. "While you're in there," he said, "I'll stop at the post office. Mrs. Aldridge said she had a package from Crane's office." "The final documents," she said. "Should be," he said. She nodded. She moved toward the dry goods store. She was 3 steps away when he said her name. "Clara." She turned. I was standing in the middle of the street, and he was looking at her with an expression she had no name for and had stopped needing one. It was simply his expression, the one he had when he meant something, when he'd decided to say a real thing. "I'm glad," he said, "that the stagecoach was late." She looked at him. She thought about a broken wheel in Wyoming, and a night sleeping against her luggage, and 2 days of telling herself everything would be fine. "So am I," she said. She went into the dry goods store. She stood at the counter and asked for thread, and watched through the window while Caleb walked up the street toward the post office, and she pressed her hand against her mother's necklace, and thought about the woman in Galesburg who had pressed that same book of territorial law into her hands and said, "You never know when you'll need to know what belongs to you." She thought, "I know now. Not the ranch. Not the legal victory. Not the thread she was buying, or the letter from the lawyer that would make everything official. Those were real, and they mattered, but they were not what she meant. She meant the knowledge, the bone-deep, finally settled knowledge that she had always been worth something. That the shopkeeper's laughter had been about him, not about her. That the 6 cents and the cracked suitcase and the long road from Illinois had not defined her. They had simply been the road. And that the road had led here, to this town, to that ranch. To a man who had said a person ought to be able to ask for fairness, and meant it as a law he lived by. She paid for the thread. She tucked it into her pocket. She walked out into the July sun to find him. He was waiting for her outside the post office with an envelope in his hand, and an expression she had learned to read. Not the careful, managed expression of the early weeks, but the newer one, the one that let her see the machinery underneath. Something was wrong. She crossed the street without hurrying, because hurrying in the middle of Millhaven's main street would draw attention, and she had given this town enough to look at for one summer. She came to stand beside him and looked at the envelope. "Crane," she said. "No," he said. He held it out. She took it. The return address was a law office in Chicago she didn't recognize. The envelope was addressed to Miss Clara Bennett, care of Whitmore Ranch, Millhaven, Montana Territory. Someone had known where to find her. Her hands were steady when she opened it. She read it once. She read it again. Then she stood on the main street of Millhaven in the July heat and let the words rearrange themselves into something she could hold. "What is it?" Caleb said. She looked up at him. "My mother's house," she said. "Back in Galesburg. I thought it was gone. The bank took it after she died. I couldn't make the payments. I had to leave." She looked at the letter again. "Her brother, my uncle, he bought it back 2 months ago. He's been trying to reach me." She paused. "He's offering it to me. The house. He says it's mine if I want to come home." The word home sat in her mouth with a complicated weight. Caleb was very still beside her. She could feel the stillness of him without looking up from the letter. The particular quality of a man who is holding himself carefully in place while he waits to hear something that matters to him. She folded the letter. She put it in her pocket. She looked at the dry goods store across the street, at the thread she'd just bought at the cracked heel of her boot in the dust of the street. "Clara," he said. His voice was even. "Careful. You don't have to answer that right now." "I know," she said. "You can take time." "I know," she said again. She looked at him. I was watching her with the open expression, fully open, now nothing held back, and she saw in it everything. He was not saying everything. He had not yet found the words for everything that had been building since the morning with the biscuit dough and the land agent letter and every morning since. "I'm not going back to Galesburg," she said. Something in his face shifted, just slightly. "You don't have to decide. Caleb." She said his name the way he said hers, deliberately having weighed it. "I'm not going back to Galesburg," she said. "I don't want to go back." She held his gaze. "I want to stay here. If that's—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together and started again. "If you'll have me, not as your cook, as—" She didn't finish. He looked at her for a long moment. A long, full, quiet moment in the middle of Millhaven's main street, with the sun coming down and the dust sitting still in the air. "Clara Bennett," he said. "Caleb Whitmore," she said. "I have been trying," he said slowly, "for about 6 weeks to find the right time to say something to you. And I have failed to find it every single day, because every time I think I'm ready, you do something that makes me understand. I don't have words for what I actually mean." She waited. "So I'm going to say the plain version," he said. "The plain version is that this ranch has been dying since Eleanor left. Not the land was fine. The house was fine. But the life in it was dying." He paused. "You walked into my kitchen and you started it back up. And it wasn't just the cooking, and it wasn't just the garden, and it wasn't just the deed or the letters or the riverbank." He looked at her directly. "It was you. The way you are. All of it." Clara did not trust herself to speak. "I am not a man who says things like this easily," he said, which she already knew. "So I'm only going to say it once, and I need you to hear it properly." He took a breath. "I love you. I don't know when it started, and I don't know exactly when I admitted it to myself, but I know it's true, the way I know the water rights are mine clearly, and without question, and with documentation, if anyone needs it." She laughed. It came out of her helplessly, the laugh, and her eyes were wet, and she didn't care, because they were standing in the middle of a street, and she was laughing and crying at the same time, and somehow this was exactly right. "That is the least romantic and most perfect thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. "I told you I wasn't good at it," he said. "You're better at it than you think," she said. She stepped toward him. "I love you too," she said. "I have for weeks, and I have been furiously pretending otherwise." "I know," he said. "Hector noticed before I did." "Oh God," she said. "Pete knew too," he said. "Sam probably knew before any of us. He just didn't say anything because Sam never says anything." She pressed her hand over her mouth and laughed again. He reached out and took her other hand, the one holding her pocket where the letter was, and he held it the way he'd held it coming up the riverbank, but this time he didn't let go. They stood on the main street of Millhaven, 2 people holding hands in public, and several passers-by noticed, and Clara didn't care even a little bit. "Let's go home," she said. "Yes," he said. "Let's." The ride back to the ranch was nothing like the ride into town. Coming in, they had been 2 people moving in parallel. Going back, they were 2 people moving together, and the difference was not dramatic or announced. It was simply there in the way they spoke, and the way the silences between words felt like conversation rather than distance. She told him about Galesburg properly, the full version, the parts she'd been sparing with. Her mother's illness, and the medical bills, and the bank, and the morning she'd had to pack a single suitcase and leave a house that still had her mother's handwriting on the recipes pinned inside the pantry door. He listened the way he listened to everything completely, without filling the pauses prematurely. "Did you go back?" he said. "After she died?" "I couldn't," she said. "The bank had it by then, and I didn't want to see it belong to someone else." She paused. "My uncle buying it back. I didn't know he'd done that. We haven't been close. He felt guilty, I think, that he couldn't help sooner." "Will you write to him?" Caleb said. "Yes," she said. "I'll thank him, and I'll tell him I've found somewhere I want to be." She glanced at him sideways. "He'll want to know I'm settled." "Are you?" Caleb said. "Settled." She looked at the road ahead. She thought about the kitchen and the garden with the seeds pushing through the baked earth, and the roses behind the barn running wild, and Amos leaning against her leg with the confident weight of an old dog who has made up his mind about someone. "More settled than I've been in years," she said. He nodded once in the way that meant he understood not just the words, but the whole shape of what she'd said. They came over the ridge, and the ranch appeared below them in the valley, and Clara looked at it the way she'd looked at it the first time, but what she saw now was entirely different. Not because it had changed, though it had changed the fences tighter and the garden green and the house with its windows open to the summer air. It was different because she was different. Because what the eye sees depends entirely on where the heart is standing. "It looks like a home," she said. "It is one," he said, "now." Hector knew before they were off the horses. He came out of the barn and looked at them and looked specifically at their hands. They weren't holding hands anymore, they were just riding. But something had changed in the way they moved near each other, and Hector was a man who noticed things, and he said nothing, but he took both horses with a briskness that suggested he was removing himself from the vicinity with great efficiency and possibly suppressing something. Pete was less subtle. Pete came around the corner of the bunkhouse and stopped dead and looked at them and said, "Well, it's about time," and then had the good sense to disappear before Caleb could respond. Sam was sitting on the porch steps when they came up to the house. He looked at them. He looked back at the mountains. He said evening, and went inside, which from Sam was practically a standing ovation. Clara was still laughing when she got to the kitchen. She started supper, and Caleb sat at the table, and they talked the way they'd been learning to talk easy back and forth about the ranch and the harvest and the north fence, and whether Hector's bad knee was going to be a problem come winter. Ordinary things, the skeleton of a shared life. But underneath the ordinary things was everything that had been said on the main street of Millhaven, still warm, still real, like a fire that had been lit and was burning steadily now and would not go out easily. She put supper on this table and called the men in, and they ate together the way they always ate. Hector quiet. Pete talkative, Sam eating with focused efficiency, and Caleb sat at the head of the table the way he always sat, except that tonight he laughed twice at things. Pete said, "Real laughs," and Pete looked so genuinely startled the first time that Clara had to look at her plate. After supper, the men went to the bunkhouse, and she cleaned the kitchen, and Caleb stayed at the table reading the final documents from Crane's office, the ones confirming the withdrawal, the ones that made it official. She could hear the occasional turn of a page, and the sound was so ordinary and so right that she had to stop what she was doing for a moment and simply stand there feeling it. "Clara," he said. She said. "Come read this." She dried her hands and came to the table and looked over his shoulder at the document. His finger was on a paragraph halfway down the page. She read it. The Territorial Land Office had not only invalidated Reed's claim. They had, in light of the forged document and the investigation it had triggered, formally reconfirmed the Whitmore deed, including the water rights, with a notation that the confirmation carried the full authority of the territorial government and would be binding in any future dispute. "It's ironclad," she said. "It's ironclad," he agreed. She looked at the document. She looked at the neat lines of official language that she had helped bring into existence by reading an old deed on a kitchen table and writing letters at night by lamplight. "We did this," she said. "You did this," he said. She put her hand on his shoulder. It was the first time she'd touched him with that kind of ease, the easy, natural touch of someone who has stopped calculating the distance between herself and another person. He stilled under her hand. And then, very carefully, he reached up and put his hand over hers. They stayed like that for a moment, reading the document together in a kitchen that smelled of supper and wood smoke and the herbs drying in the window. 3 days later, on a Sunday morning, Clara went to the rose garden. She went with pruning shears. She had thought about it for weeks, since the day Caleb had told her to leave it, since the day she'd stood in it and said "wild suits them" and seen something open in his face. She had waited. She had watched him move through the process of reopening Eleanor's room, of rearranging its contents, with the careful respect of a man who is honoring something without being imprisoned by it. She had watched him put the Dickens book on the shelf and open the curtains and come back to the kitchen, changed and still whole. She thought he was ready. She thought she was ready. But she had wanted to ask. She found him at the corral. "The roses behind the barn," she said. He looked at her. His eyes went to the shears in her hand. "I'd like to prune them back," she said. "Not clear them, just manage them. Cut out the dead canes and let the healthy ones have room." She met his gaze. "They're not going anywhere. They're just getting in their own way." He was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor would have done it every spring," he said. She was particular about it. "I'll be careful," Clara said. He looked at the shears. He looked at her. "She'd have liked that," he said. "She'd have hated that they've been left to go wild." Something moved in his expression. The grief and the other thing at the same time, the two of them living together in him now, instead of the grief alone. "Go ahead," he said. "I'll come help in a bit." She nodded. She went around the barn. She worked for an hour before she heard him come through the gap in the fence. He came in and picked up the spare pair of shears hanging on the barn wall and stood beside her and looked at the roses, the way a person looks at something they've been avoiding so long it's become a habit. "The pink ones are the strongest," she said. "These white ones on the south side are getting crowded out. If we take back some of these old canes—" "She used to put them on the table," he said. "The pink ones, all summer." "We can do that again," Clara said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "We can." They worked side by side in the enclosed space behind the barn, cutting and clearing, and the smell of the roses was thick in the summer heat, and neither of them spoke much, but the silence was the kind that is full rather than empty. The kind that two people make together when they are comfortable enough not to need words to fill it. After a while he said, "I was thinking about the east room." "Which one?" "The small one off the hall," he said. "I've been using it for accounts. It doesn't need to be that." He cut a dead cane and set it aside. "It would make a good study. If someone needed a place to write letters and keep books and—" He paused. "Store a certain volume of territorial law that I notice has been living on the kitchen shelf." Clara stopped working. She looked at him. I was looking at the roses he was pruning with great attention. "You're offering me a room," she said. "I'm offering you a space," he said. "That's yours. Not the kitchen, which is also yours, but a room that's specifically yours, to work in." He glanced at her sideways. "You write a lot of letters." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it meant a room in this house designated hers. Not a hired hand's quarters at the end of the West Hall. A room that meant you belong here, you are part of this place, this is not temporary. "I'll need a better desk," she said. "There's one in the storeroom," he said. "Hector can move it." "And a lamp," she said. "The oil lamp in my room is not bright enough for small writing." "I'll get one from town," he said. "And—" She stopped. "What?" he said. She looked at the roses. She reached out and touched one of the healthy pink canes, not cutting, just touching, feeling the live wood under her fingers. "Nothing," she said. "That's enough. That's more than enough." He made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the family of one. They finished the pruning as the morning wore on into noon, and the rose garden looked like itself again cared for, shaped the healthy canes given room to breathe, and the dead ones cleared away. Still wild at the edges, still Eleanor's, but tended, loved, present. Caleb gathered the cut canes into a pile and looked at the work. "Better," he said. "Much better," she agreed. He looked at her with the open expression, fully open, nothing behind it, and he said, "Thank you, for this." "It needed doing," she said. "Clara." He said it with the weight he always gave it. "I know what it needed. I'm thanking you for what you did." She held his gaze. "You're welcome," she said, and she meant it simply, without deflection. He picked up the cane pile. She carried the shears. They came back around the barn into the yard, and Amos rose from his patch of shade and walked to Clara with his dignified, deliberate walk, and leaned against her leg with his whole considerable weight. "He does that every time," Caleb said. "I know," she said. She reached down and put her hand on the old dog's head. "He knows what he likes." Caleb looked at the dog and then at her and said, "So do I," and then turned toward the barn before she could answer, which she thought was entirely deliberate, and told her more about how far he'd come than any speech would have. The letter to her uncle she wrote that Sunday evening at the kitchen table with the good lamp brought in from the hall, because the East Room study was not yet arranged. She told him she was well. She told him she was in Montana Territory, employed at a ranch outside Millhaven, that she had found good work and good people, and intended to stay. She thanked him for recovering the house in Galesburg, and she meant the thanks genuinely It was an act of love even late, and she recognized it as such. She told him she did not need the house. She told him to sell it if he wished, or keep it, or let it to someone who needed a home because she had one. She paused with her pen above the paper for a moment. Then she wrote, "I have one here. I did not expect to find it, but I have. I think Mama would have approved." She sealed the letter and set it with the others to go to town. Then she sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen with her hand over her mother's necklace, and she thought about the woman who had worn it before her, practical and loving, economical with words, and extravagant with care. And she thought about what her mother had said. "You are more capable than you think you are, Clara. The trouble is, you've never been in a situation that required you to prove it." She looked at the kitchen. At the shelves she had reorganized, and the herbs in the window, and the cast-iron pot she'd scrubbed clean, and the table where she had sat across from Caleb Whitmore and explained the law of water rights to a man who had been quietly losing sleep over it for weeks. She looked at all of it, and she thought, "I proved it, Mama. I think I proved it." She pressed her hand flat against the necklace and felt its familiar shape through the fabric of her dress. Then she got up and checked the stove and went to bed in the room at the end of the West Hall, and she slept the way she'd been sleeping for weeks, soundly, fully, in a house that felt like it was holding her rather than simply containing her. The twist came the next morning, and it came from a direction she had not been watching. She was in the garden, the kitchen garden she'd planted in the baked earth 6 weeks ago. The one Hector had looked at like she was optimistic to the point of delusion, which was now producing with a determination that she found personally gratifying. She was checking the bean plants when she heard the horse, a single horse coming fast from the south road. The same direction Reed's man had come from the day of the river accident. She straightened and shaded her eyes. It was not Briggs. It was a woman. Clara had not seen many women ride like that in her life. Flat out. No side saddle hair coming loose from its pins. Riding like someone who has a destination and intends to reach it before anything can stop her. She was perhaps 40, handsome in a strong-featured way, and she pulled up in the yard with the horse blowing and looked at Clara with an expression that was searching and direct and not entirely friendly. "You're Clara Bennett," the woman said. "I am," Clara said. "I'm Margaret Aldrich," the woman said. "My husband owns the Aldrich spread 15 miles west." She swung down from the horse with a practiced ease and stood in the yard with her hands at her sides. "I've heard about you. What you did with Reed's land claim. What you did at the river." Clara waited. "I need your help," Margaret said. And the way she said it directly, without performance, one capable woman to another, stripped away any possibility of social maneuvering. It was simply the truth. "My husband's deed has the same vulnerability yours did. Different water rights, same valley. And Reed before his..." She paused. "Change of heart had already started the process against us. We found out this week." Clara looked at her. She looked at the horse, still breathing hard. She looked at this woman who had ridden 15 miles before breakfast to ask for help. "Come inside," Clara said. "I'll make coffee." Margaret looked at the house at the kitchen door Clara was already moving toward. "I don't want to impose. You rode 15 miles to ask for help that I can give," Clara said over her shoulder. "That's not an imposition. That's a reasonable decision." She looked back. "Come in." Margaret followed her inside. They were at the kitchen table with coffee and the Aldrich deed spread between them. When Caleb came in from the barn, stopped in the doorway, looked at the scene. Margaret Aldrich, the deed. Clara's notes already started on a fresh piece of paper, and then looked at Clara with an expression of such complete unsurprise that she almost laughed. "Caleb, this is Margaret Aldrich," Clara said. "Her husband's deed has a water rights problem. I'm going to help her read it." He looked at the deed. He looked at Clara. He said, "I'll put more water on," and turned to the stove. Margaret watched this exchange with an expression that was recalibrating something in her assessment of the situation. "You're Mr. Whitmore," she said to Clara, lowering her voice slightly. "Yes," Clara said. "He just accepted that." "He tends to," Clara said. She was already reading the deed. "My husband would have had 17 questions," Margaret said. "Caleb trusts me," Clara said simply. She felt him at the stove hear that. She felt the slight change in the room that happened when a true thing lands where it's meant to. "Let me show you what I'm looking at," Clara said, and turned the deed toward Margaret, and they got to work. By noon, Clara had read the Aldrich deed twice, found 3 sections that were relevant, and written a letter to Archibald Crane in Billings that laid out the situation in plain language. By mid-afternoon, 2 more ranchers had ridden in. She hadn't expected that. But Margaret had apparently told someone she was coming to Whitmore's ranch, and that someone had told someone else, and there were apparently several families in the valley who had been quietly afraid of Thomas Reed for years, and who had watched the outcome of the Whitmore situation with a very specific kind of attention. Clara sat at the kitchen table with deeds and documents spread across the entire surface, and wrote letters, and answered questions, and explained territorial law in plain American English, while Caleb kept the coffee coming, and Hector materialized from somewhere to feed the horses of the visitors, and Pete took one look at the situation and quietly cleaned up the yard without being asked. At one point, Caleb sat down across from her with his own coffee and watched her explain a conveyance clause to a weathered rancher named Delaney, who kept shaking his head like he was trying to dislodge something. When Delaney finally understood and sat back with a relieved exhale, Caleb caught Clara's eye across the table. "I didn't say anything." He just looked at her with that full, open expression, the one that had no management in it, and she saw what was in it, clearly pride. Not the possessive proprietary pride of a man claiming a woman's accomplishment. The genuine pride of someone watching a person they love be exactly who they are fully and without apology. She looked back at him. She pressed her lips together against the smile that wanted to come. "More coffee," she said. "Please," said Delaney, and the moment folded back into work. The last visitor left in the late afternoon, and Clara sat alone at the kitchen table for a moment in the sudden quiet, looking at the papers in front of her. 4 deeds. 4 families. 4 situations that were variations on the same theme. People who had owned their land honestly and in good faith, and who had been quietly threatened by a man who counted on them not knowing how to fight back. She could help them. She already had today. But she could do more. She could write to Crane and establish a process. She could read deeds. She could write letters. She could translate legal language into plain speech and give people the tools to protect what was theirs. She was sitting with this thought still and quiet with it when Caleb came back into the kitchen and sat down across from her and looked at her face. "What are you thinking?" he said. She looked at him. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that this valley has a lot of people who need someone who can read a deed and write a letter." She paused. "And I'm thinking that I could do that, regularly, not just when someone rides in desperate, but as—" She stopped. "As a practice," he said. She looked at him. "That's a very formal word for it." "It's what it is," he said. "You read law, you write well, you explain it clearly. People need that." He paused. "There's no lawyer in Millhaven." "There's not," she said. "Nearest one is 40 miles east," he said. "And he charges more than most families here make in 2 months." Clara looked at her hands. She thought about the East Room, the desk Hector was going to move, the lamp Caleb was going to bring from town. The room that was already being prepared, she now realized for something larger than she'd understood when he'd offered it. "Did you know this would happen?" she said. "Today, the people coming." He looked at her steadily. "I knew it was possible," he said. "Once word got out about what you'd done with the land claim, I thought—" He paused. "I thought it was likely." "And you didn't say anything," she said. "It wasn't my thing to say," he said simply. "It's yours." She sat with that. She sat with the knowledge that this man had cleared a room and planned a desk, and said nothing, simply made space, and waited for her to find her own way into it. "Caleb Whitmore," she said. "Clara Bennett," he said. "That is—" She stopped. She breathed. "You are a remarkably decent man." "I had a good example this summer," he said. She looked at him across the table at this man who had been silent in a store in Millhaven and put money down without being asked and offered her work instead of pity, and who had unlocked a room after 4 years and opened a curtain and said it needed air, and who had stood in a river to save the man who was trying to take his land and called it simply what a person does. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. "Stay," he said. Not asking, not exactly. It was somewhere between a question and a certainty, the way some true things live in the space between what you hope and what you know. "I told you in Millhaven," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." "I know," he said. "I just like hearing it." She laughed, and the laugh filled the kitchen, the way the cooking smells did, warmly, completely, like something that belonged there. A month later, Clara Bennett sat at the desk in the East Room with the good lamp lit against the evening writing letters. Hector had moved the desk. Caleb had brought the lamp from town, a good one, with a wide shade, the kind you could write under for hours without your eyes aching. The bookshelves on the east wall held a growing collection. Her uncle's territorial law Volume 2 deed registers she'd borrowed from the county recorder's office, a dictionary, a copy of Montana Territory statutes, and a stack of correspondence files organized by family name. The rose garden had been pruned and was blooming. The kitchen garden was producing more than 4 men and 1 woman could eat, and she'd begun trading the surplus in town for supplies, which Hector thought was brilliant, and which Caleb pretended to find merely practical, and which Pete talked about to anyone who would listen. Amos lay under her desk while she worked, his breathing slow and steady, the warm weight of him against her feet. She was finishing the last letter of the evening to Crane in Billings regarding the Delaney deed when she heard Caleb's boots in the hall. He stopped in the doorway of the East Room and leaned against the frame the way he leaned against things easy and present, and looked at her at the desk. "Almost done," she said without looking up. "No hurry," he said. She finished the letter and folded it and added it to the stack for town. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at him in the doorway, and the lamp was warm between them, and the house was full of the sounds of an evening. In late summer, the horses in the corral, the creak of the structure, the far call of something out on the ridge, and it was the most complete silence she had ever inhabited. "I've been thinking," she said. "That's generally how trouble starts," he said. "Caleb, what have you been thinking?" She looked at the desk, at the letters and the law books and the lamp, at the room he had cleared and offered and made hers. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said. "In Millhaven, when I asked why you offered me work the first day." "I said you stood your ground," he said. "You said it was worth something," she said. She looked at him. "I spent a long time before I came here believing that I wasn't worth something, that the shopkeeper and the people who laughed and every door that closed in my face were evidence of a fact about me." She paused. "I don't believe that anymore." He was quiet, watching her. "I want to tell you that," she said. "Not because I need you to have fixed it. You didn't fix it, I did with the work I did and the choices I made. But because you gave me a place to do it in, and that matters." She held his gaze. "You matter, to me, more than I know how to say with any efficiency." He pushed away from the doorframe and came into the room. He came to the desk and stood beside her chair, and she looked up at him from where she sat, and he looked down at her with the full, open, unguarded expression that was his real face, the one he'd been wearing more and more, the one she thought of as simply him. He reached down and touched the necklace at her throat, just lightly, the pressed glass pendant on its chain. "He said it was worthless," Caleb said. Galt. "How was wrong?" she said. "Yes," he said. "He was." He straightened. He offered her his hand, not to help her up, just to hold, just to have, and she took it, and they stood together in the East Room with the lamp burning and the Montana evening coming full outside the window. "Come sit on the porch," he said. "The sky's doing something worth seeing." She let him pull her up. She kept his hand. They walked through the hall and out the front door and onto the porch, and the sky above the mountains was in full performance. Colors that had no right to exist outside of a painting. Deep orange and rose gold, and the first pale edge of a purple dark coming down from the east. Amos came with them and settled at their feet with the certainty of an old dog who knows where he belongs. Clara stood beside Caleb on the porch of a house that had been silent for 4 years and was silent no more, and she thought about a woman in Illinois who had pressed a law book into her daughter's hands and said, "You never know when you'll need to know what belongs to you." She thought, "I know now, Mama. I know exactly what belongs to me." Not the ranch, not the legal victory, not even the man standing beside her, his hand warm in hers, his shoulder close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him. What belonged to her was this, the knowledge of her own worth, the certainty of her own capability. The understanding arrived at through 6 cents and a cracked suitcase and 600 miles of hard road that she had never been what anyone said she was in a store in Millhaven. She had always been this woman, standing on this porch, holding this hand. She'd simply needed to travel far enough to arrive. Caleb turned and looked at her in the fading light. "You're smiling," he said. "I'm happy," she said, simply, like a fact. He looked at her for a moment with everything he had and nothing held back. "So am I," he said. And on the front porch of a ranch in Montana Territory, in the summer of 1887, two broken people stood together in the last light and watched the sky go dark, and they were not broken anymore. They were home.